doing the wrong thing. But it is around helping to support the connection among our PEFL group members and understanding different ideas and supports to study our challenges or opportunities, our bright spots, whatever we want to call them, and provide some support that way. So this morning, I'm super excited to welcome Dr. Lydia Ross to our she's our featured speaker, presenter. And Dr. Ross is an assistant professor in the Division of Policy, Practice, and Leadership, and has extensive background in quantitative and qualitative methods, as well as action research focused methods as well. She is absolutely amazing to work with as a research partner. She has international experience as well, supporting doctoral students in different contexts, understanding the best measures to use to inform their practice. So I'm really excited for Dr. Ross to present today. I am personally expecting to learn and apply the content out of this session in my own work. So, Dr. Ross, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and it's yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. I am excited to be here with you all today. Let me share my screen. Um, okay, is it showing all right? Okay, perfect. Just want to make sure. So, today I'll be talking about integrating theoretical frameworks into educational research. And I've tried to prepare this talk to cover a broad range. So maybe some of you are already quite familiar with theory, maybe some of you aren't as familiar, but either way, I hope this is a good reminder of how we might think about integrating these in to practices that we might already be doing or future contexts that we are looking to do research in. So as an agenda for today, we'll start with a reflective noticing activity. Then I'll spend some time talking about why theory matters, theoretical and conceptual frameworks. I'll give a high-level overview of what I think are some foundational frameworks in education that you all might consider using. We'll give an example of applying theory to practice, and then I want to end with some time for you to have an opportunity to reflect on how theory might work in your own research, and then hopefully some time for Q&A at the end. So I wanted to start with a reflective noticing activity, and in a moment on the next slide, we are going to figuratively move through a new landscape together. And as we do, I just want us all to reflect on what we notice in the space. So here's a photo of a landscape. You can imagine this place or you can imagine another place, whatever you would like. But what I would like you to think about for just a minute is, what do you focus on? So what are you finding your attention drawn to? Are there aspects that you're not really paying attention to? Do things feel familiar or unfamiliar? And what assumptions do you make about the place? So I'll give us maybe just a minute to sit and think quietly. If you want to type any noticings that you have into the chat, feel free, but you don't need to. Okay. Thank you to those of you who shared. Feel free to still share if you'd like. But what I'm seeing is we all are noticing different things, right? Some people, I think Dr. Thompson commented on the snow, a number of you commented on the sky. Um, Somebody commented on trees or that there's a path, but we all notice different things. And the highlight that I want to take away from here is that the place or this imaginary space that we're looking at, it didn't change, but the perspectives that each of us brought to this did change. And that's what happens in research. And that's what happens with applying theory to different research contexts is it gives us perspective. So we'll kind of keep this idea of perspectives and noticings as we go through. Okay. So I wanted to start with talking about why theoretical frameworks matter before I talk about what theoretical frameworks are and different theories that we might use. So at this point, I want to pause and normalize something that I see happening often in research. As Dr. Thompson mentioned, I do quite a bit of work with our EDD or doctorate in education students or master students or just other people who are beginning research. And many times, what practitioner researchers might find is that they have incredibly rich data that they've collected. And maybe this is something that already feels familiar to you, but you have all of this data, maybe it's student work or survey data, artifacts, assessment data. But when it comes time for you to write up or talk about your findings, sometimes there can be uncertainty. What exactly should you say about this? What does this mean? How do you connect it all? Maybe the descriptive or maybe the findings feel a bit more descriptive than explanatory. So you might be able to say, here's what I see, but explaining why something happened or how they are connected can be a bit of a challenge. Sometimes you also might find that you have one set of data that might be telling one story, but another data set is telling you something else, and it can be hard to reconcile why that happens. Um, so, when a study doesn't have an explicit theoretical framework or guiding theory around it, it can cause a few of those challenges. First, it can become unclear what deserves the most attention. So, all of it can feel important, right? And it can be really hard to make decisions about where you might focus your attention and what you want to call attention to. It can also be hard when interpretation becomes inconsistent. So, one finding could be explained in one way, and another finding or piece of data might explain something in a totally different way, and there might not be logic necessarily connecting them. And over time, this can become problematic, right? Because we might overlook important patterns. And it's not because we're not skilled as researchers, but it's because we don't necessarily have a guiding lens that helps us recognize which patterns are theoretically meaningful. And so as a result, the findings can be fragmented or superficial, or even if we have strong underlying data. And so this is where I want to offer a reframe and bring in the role of theory into research. So theoretical frameworks or using theory isn't an add-on that we do at the end of the study just to make it sound more academic or official, but instead theoretical frameworks shape how research problems are defined from the very beginning. They influence what we decide to study, the very questions that we ask, the data that we collect, and how we decide to analyze the data. They also are incredibly important for how we interpret what we find. Theory helps us decide which explanations make sense and how our findings connect to broader conversations within educational spaces. Um, and so, a metaphor that really resonates with me about theory is this idea of glasses, right? So, if I put on a pair of glasses that's really magnifying, I might be able to see really minute details in a situation. So maybe I can see the little leaves or like blades of grass in that landscape or focus on really minute details in classrooms. But I might also then put on a different pair of glasses that gives me a wide panoramic view of different things. My glasses could have different color lenses, but whatever pair of glasses I put on, it will change how I approach a situation, even if that context is remaining the same. So if we think about a classroom, the classroom's not changing, but the glasses or theories that we use will help illuminate different patterns or ideas or things that we want to look at. Um, so I'll keep coming back to that glasses idea because that really resonates with me, but maybe you have another idea that resonates with you for this, and I would always welcome hearing that in the chat. So now that we've talked about why theoretical frameworks matter, I want to slow down and make sure we're clear on what these different phrases mean. So I'm going to talk about theory, theoretical frameworks, and conceptual frameworks, and then talk a little bit about the assumptions that these frameworks rest on and how that shows up in our research. So let's start with theory. A theory is a set of ideas that explains how and why a phenomenon occurs. And the important thing to remember with theories is that they're not individual opinions or personal beliefs, but they are bodies of knowledge that are built over time through research, evidence, and scholarly conversations. So You might hear the expression theories with a capital T because they're usually these big bodies of work that people have developed to help us explain things. And so in education, theories might help us explain how things like learning happens, how student motivation develops, how student identity forms and how that influences learning, or how different systems operate in educational contexts. And theories are really powerful because they give us a way to explain things beyond just a single classroom or a single context. So you might notice something in a classroom, but through theory, we connect that to what's happening in other places. Um, Another important point that I'd like to make is that theories are not static. They are developed, tested, critiqued, and refined over time. So they are constantly evolving with scholars and researchers and practitioners as we learn more and develop our knowledge of these different areas. So a few big examples of theories would be Bourdieu's capital, there's learning theory, Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, self-determination theory, and many more. So one thing I want to highlight with today is I'll be offering a few examples, but there are so many different theories out there, and there are all these great researchers and scholars and practitioners who have developed these. So I'll give a few examples, but there's a huge body of scholarship and knowledge that you can draw on to find other theories. So there's an important shift that happens when we take a theory and then we move to a theoretical framework. In many research studies or contexts, we wouldn't use an entire theory because they're really big, they're broad, they're complex, they're huge, right? There's so much stuff that is in each theory. And oftentimes within a single study, we're usually focused on a specific problem or context. So we need to narrow our focus and use a theoretical framework. And so a theoretical framework is how we draw from a theory in a particular study. So we would take a big theory and say, okay, these three or four ideas really resonate with this particular context that I'm looking at. And so you would pull those out into a theoretical framework. And so again, theories are broad and exist across a field, whereas a theoretical framework represents how a researcher will bring a theory into a specific study to guide their focus and interpretation. It draws on established theory to explain how it occurs, but then is narrowed to the scope of that study. Theoretical frameworks help us shape what we pay attention to in our data, and it influences which patterns stand out as meaningful and can help us develop plausible explanations. So, two researchers could study the same classroom, collect the same data, and still arrive at different interpretations, not because either one is wrong, but because they might be working from different theoretical frameworks or backgrounds. So being really explicit about a theoretical framework can help make your interpretive choices visible and transparent and guide you as you are conducting research. So a conceptual framework is a little bit different than a theoretical framework, but they're often used interchangeably. Excuse me, a conceptual framework is very study specific. And so the conceptual framework helps us organize key concepts and relationships in your study, in your context. So you would not see a conceptual framework usually repeated across studies because it would be developed just for that. The key distinction, though, between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework is a theoretical framework draws from one theory, whereas a conceptual framework might take concepts from multiple theories and then pull them together. This can be really powerful because sometimes theories might overlap, or in social sciences and in education, as I'm sure we all know, it can be really complex, and one theory might not explain it well enough. So we can take concepts across theories and make it really specific and tailored to the context and the questions that we are looking at. This slide is more just a summary to make sure I wanted this to be resources for everybody later. But theoretical frameworks, again, draw from established theories, whereas conceptual frameworks are study specific. Theoretical frameworks come from only one theory, whereas conceptual frameworks will come from multiple theories. And these aren't necessarily in competition with one another. It just depends on which makes the most sense for your context. So at this point, I think it is also important to recognize that theory and theoretical frameworks are grounded in a lot deeper assumptions. And so I'm briefly going to cover these three different main assumptions that we might see, but I want to recognize that this is very complex. There are huge bodies of knowledge just on these areas alone, and this could really span an entire semester or class. And so I just want to name them here. I've provided some resources that I think will be shared out with everybody later of readings, and I've kind of grouped readings for each of these by the subject in my talk, and there are quite a few readings related to ontology, epistemology, and axiology. So if you find this really interesting, you can go read about it more, but I just wanted to quickly name them. So these assumptions reflect beliefs about what exists in educational settings, how we produce knowledge, and values that guide our research decision. So let's start with ontology, which is simply about what we believe exists in research context and what we consider quote unquote real or worth studying. So, in educational research, ontology shapes whether we focus primarily on individuals, whether we focus on relationships between people, maybe we focus more on systems like schools or policies, or less visible things such as identities, norms, and structures. So some research might treat learning as something that happens more inside individual students, while other research could treat it as something that happens more in interactions. Again, these aren't right or wrong inherently, but they just lead us to notice different things. And so whatever ontological view that you take can shift and determine how you might approach research. Epistemology is about how we believe knowledge is produced and understood. So, in other words, how do we know what we know? And this involves assumptions about whether knowledge comes primarily from measurement and observation, if it happens from interaction and dialogue, or if we might get knowledge from lived experiences and meaning making. These assumptions can influence what we count as evidence. So, some researchers might prioritize test scores and numbers and want things to be more numeric, while other people might want classroom data, interviews, or observations. Again, not right or wrong, and not just methodological choices, but they reflect deeper beliefs about the kinds of knowledge that are legitimate and meaningful. And then lastly, axiology refers to the values that guide research. Um, so this includes what outcomes we care about, what questions we believe are worth asking, and the responsibility that we feel we hold as researchers and practitioners. So in education, we have values such as equality, improvement, efficiency, justice, and cultural relevance that can shape our research decisions and how we might approach studies. For example, if you're really focused on efficiency, a study might ask different questions than somebody who's more focused on cultural relevance, even if they're focused on the same educational setting. Axiology reminds us that research is not value free, but our values shape what we study and how we interpret what we find. Again, we all bring different lenses to our context, and so that will then show up in how we look at things. So one reason I wanted to show these all on one slide is that they're deeply interconnected. What we believe exists influences how we believe knowledge is produced, and both of these are shaped by what we value. And they're not right or wrong, they're just viewpoints that we have that will influence choices that we make later. Okay. So now that we've talked a little bit about ontology, epistemology, and axiology, which are definitely a bit abstract, um, I want to give a chance for us to reflect. And so I've put some questions up here on the slide that you can think about. And what I would encourage each of us to do is think about a research context that we care about. It could be a classroom, a program, a school, or a broader issue. And we'll have a few other reflections as we go throughout the rest of the session. So think about a context and then look at these questions. And I'll give us maybe 3 minutes just to have some quiet reflection time. You can just jot this down. We're not going to share this out. It doesn't need to be a finished product, but just an opportunity to reflect. Okay. We will keep moving on, but these are questions that you can keep coming back to, and they can be still think about these often as I change where I'm doing research. So just a good reflexive exercise as you continue on as researchers. So now that we've talked a little bit about assumptions and what theory and theoretical framework is, I want to offer a few key frameworks in education research. Um, so, as I talk about these, you can think about how some of those assumptions might show up. And the important thing that I want to highlight with these is this is not exhaustive at all. I am picking four big examples that I see often. However, there are lots of other research theories that you could use in your own context. So, um, again, just bear that in mind. So here are the four that I'm going to highlight today. And these are big bodies of theories. So each of these have theories underneath them. So these are just kind of like big buckets that I've grouped together, but I think they're salient and can be helpful for education research. So sociocultural theories emphasize interaction and context, whereas identity theories focus on self-recognition and belonging for individuals. Culturally responsive theories and frameworks emphasize culture as an asset, and then critical theories or perspectives emphasize power and structural conditions. So for each of these slides, I've kind of grouped it where I'm sharing the core idea, what the theories assume, what it might help you focus on as a researcher. I highlight some of the foundational theories with the researchers listed, and then some potential questions. And again, this was meant to kind of be as a guide that you might come back to later. So um, hopefully that will be helpful later. Sociocultural theories start from the assumption that learning is fundamentally a social process. So that's where they begin. And so, because of that, these theories assume that learning doesn't happen in a vacuum or in isolation inside individuals, but it happens through interaction, through language, culture, and tools that people use together to create learning. So, theories that fall under sociocultural theories will assume that knowledge is constructed through participation in social practices, which means that learning is shared and shaped by who is present, how people interact, and what cultural and historical contexts surround those interactions. So, from these perspectives, classrooms aren't places where information is just transmitted, but they serve as social spaces where meaning is negotiated, different roles are taken up, and learning is mediated through talk, text, and technology. Sociocultural theories help researchers focus on classroom discourse, collaborative learning, and peer relationships, but they also can help us focus our attention on tools, which could be language, maybe curriculum materials, or different classroom technologies that can help shape how learning unfolds. And so, potential questions that you might ask if you were working from a sociocultural framework could be, how do social interactions shape learning, or how do cultural practices influence participation and understanding of students? Identity theories shift our attention from interaction alone, but then we focus on how learners understand themselves and how they are recognized by others. And so, from this perspective, with identity theories, learning and engagement are deeply tied to identity. And so, this could be whether students see themselves as capable, if students feel valued, if they feel like they belong in a place or in a particular learning space. Identity theories assume that identity is socially constructed and context dependent. So, as students or people move through different contexts, different identities might come up more often. And this can change also over time, and then also in response to how others might treat them or how they feel others are perceiving them. So, it's very focused on individual identities and thoughts about the self. Identity theories can help researchers focus on experiences of belonging and recognition, but also student motivation, how students engage in classrooms, persistence through educational spaces. And they really help us understand how students position themselves as learners or as people. Um, This might come up, for example, for people who are in STEM, there's science identity. So, and there's a lot of research that says people who have a stronger science identity, if students feel that they have a strong science identity, maybe they learn more. So these focus on those different types of identities and how it moves through education. Research questions in this tradition might include how do learners' identities shape their engagement, or how do educational contexts support or constrain identity development? Culturally responsive theories begin from the premise that students' cultural knowledge, language, and lived experience are assets for learning and not obstacles that need to be overcome. So these frameworks assume that culture is deeply integral to learning and not something that's separate from it. So learning is always happening within cultural and community contexts. And in this perspective, educational practices should build on students' existing strengths and knowledge and cultural backgrounds rather than requiring students to adapt to narrowly defined norms. And they really emphasize the importance of context and community knowledge and how that might show up in different educational spaces. Culturally responsive theories help researchers focus on curriculum relevance and representation, classroom practices that might affirm student identities or different cultures, and the relationships that happen between schools and families and communities. So, if you were to adopt culturally responsive theories, you might ask questions such as who benefits from particular educational practices, and how do policies and systems affect and work with students across different cultures. The last big bucket of theories that I'm going to talk about is critical theories. And these theories take an explicitly structural view of education. So they emphasize that education is shaped by power, inequality, or historical forces that might influence access, opportunity, and outcomes. And these theories assume that education systems are not neutral, but it really looks at power and how knowledge, policy, and practice are reproduced or have relationships through different institutions. As I mentioned, they're focused on structures. So this could be policies, schools, or systems rather than just looking at individual actions. And it encourages researchers to look beyond surface level explanations, but really instead focus on how systems or policies might advantage some groups or marginalize others, or how that relates to students. But it moves away from individuals, but more onto the structure. So, typical research questions for this might include whose knowledge is valued in classrooms, or how do instructional practices reflect or ignore students' cultural contexts. So we've just gone through several different theoretical frameworks or bodies of knowledge that you might think about. And so in a moment, I'll apply this to an example as a reflection, but I want to have space for you to go back and again think about that context that we thought of earlier and think about of these four buckets, which theoretical framework might align best with your current context that you're thinking of or interest, or if you know of other theories, you can think of that too. But why does this connect? How does it stand out to you? And how might it explain something you've been noticing but haven't maybe had language for, or how might it push you to see a problem differently? So I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to reflect on this. Okay. Next, I want to just offer a quick example of how, when we apply theory to a scenario in practice, how that might change our interpretation. So I'll walk through this and then we'll end with the reflective activity for you to come back to what you were just thinking about. So hopefully this can make a little bit more concrete about when we use different theories, how it illuminates different um, things and different questions that we might ask. And so, again, what I want to highlight in this scenario is that the imaginary classroom we're going to enter doesn't change. The data is not changing, but what changes is the lens or those glasses that we're putting on to look at the different scenario or through different eyes. So let's imagine a middle school science classroom is implementing a new group-based lesson. Students are working in small groups to solve a real world problem that's applied together. And as the lesson unfolds, the teacher, or maybe there's a research team in there, we can pretend we're the researchers in there. Maybe we notice that some students are really active and participating in the discussion, and others are remaining quiet or might be more disengaged. So we decide to collect data for this, and then we keep going back to the classroom. We collect a bunch of data, including classroom observations. We record student talk and interaction during group work, and then we look at student work samples too. So maybe this is a familiar scenario for some of you already, and if not, we can just imagine that we've been in that space together. So, if we approach this scenario using a sociocultural framework, our attention is immediately going to shift to interaction and participation. So, rather than just asking why some students are quiet, we will ask how the learning opportunities are structured through group interactions. I'll pay closer attention to who speaks and who listens and how ideas are taking up, but I'll constantly keep coming back to those interactions between students. I might also focus on the tools that are mediating the learning, such as language, diagram, or different materials. And from this perspective, differences in engagement can be understood as emerging from interactional dynamics rather than just individual ability or motivation. So I'll be focused more on those interactions. I might ask questions like, how do social interactions shape learning? And how do group norms and cultural practices influence participation? Let's say, though, we decide to adopt identity theory as a lens. So here, my attention is going to shift towards recognition, belonging, and how students are positioned as learners during these activities. So I might focus more on how students are seeing themselves in this context. Do they feel seen by their peers or their teacher? I could ask questions to them about, do they feel that they belong? Do they feel valued? Do they feel like they fit in? Because maybe that will show up in how they are talking or maybe being quieter during the group work. So from this perspective, student disengagement might be interpreted more as a response to not feeling like they belong or limited recognition, rather than a lack of interest or effort or ability. Questions I might ask with this could include, how are students recognized as contributors in group work, or how do their sense of belonging show up in their developing identities as science learners? So, just a very quick example here, but I think the important thing to highlight was we're not changing the classroom or even the data that we're looking at, but what we are changing is the theory and the lens that we're using for how we look at it. So each framework highlights different parts of learning and engagement that we would focus on as researchers. So the sociocultural lens helps us understand more about interaction and participation, while identity theory helps us understand sense of belonging and motivation. Again, neither one of these are right or wrong. It just depends what we want to look at, and it helps us guide and direct our attention. So now I want to give an opportunity to again reflect and bring it back to your own work. So I think what we will do with the time we have left is if we could go into breakout groups, maybe, and you can share the context that you were thinking about and what theory was interesting to you. And then you can just discuss that amongst the groups. Maybe somebody else might see it a different way, or you can talk about challenges that you might have in implementing that. So I can help with the breakouts.
I got
Oh, you got them. Thank you.
it.
So we'll stay in there for 8 minutes, then we'll come back at 9:20 to have a little bit of Q&A before we wrap up. Thanks, Tanya. Okay, welcome back. That went fast for my group. I imagine it did for all of you too. So we have just a little bit of time left. I hope that conversation was helpful. Maybe these are conversations you can continue after this. But with the last little bit of time, I just wanted to see if there are reflections or noticings, wonderings that came up during the breakout or the session, or questions that anybody might have. Feel free to just unmute and chat away.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
So when it comes to theoretical framework, we have to opt for only one theory. And when it comes to conceptual framework, we have like to gather a lot of concepts from a lot of theories that are related to that specific topic that we are working on.
Great question. And yes, your understanding is accurate. So, a theoretical framework typically operates from just one theory, but might take multiple, maybe two, three, four concepts from that theory that you might use just to narrow the scope. Whereas a conceptual framework blends two theories or more. So, it doesn't have to be a huge amount, but you might have two theories and maybe one or two concepts from each theory. You could have three or four theories, but we don't want it to get too complex too, right? We want it to be specific and tailored to the context that we're working in. But really good question. Oh, that's a good question in the chat from Mohammed. What should a researcher think about first, theory or practice? It's a little bit of both. It's kind of like the chicken and the egg. I think you kind of think about practice and then you think about what theory might work. And then you kind of go back to the practice and see if the theory goes. So it's kind of a little bit of both. And sometimes we might be thinking, a lot of times we just enter into situations where we might be doing research and then we have to think about a theory that we pull in and maybe it doesn't quite work. So it can be kind of cyclical. I was sharing in the breakout that sometimes we have to try on different theories before, or frameworks, right? Before it fits. Like you might think, oh, this theory should explain what I'm seeing here quite well, but then maybe you start to get into it and you realize it's not quite right. And so sometimes you have to adjust. So I think in that way, probably practice comes first and then we bring theory in. But I would encourage all of us to try not to just put theory at the very end, because the earlier we can integrate it, the more intentional we can be in our design choices. Does anyone else have thoughts or questions on that they would share or experience yourself?
I think that's a difficult question. I was wondering too, thank you for sharing some example theories. That's always helpful. But other than reading other people's literature, where do you find theories? Sometimes I feel like you just, at least for me, I go back to the same few that I feel confident with. And I know that that's not maybe the best choice.
That's a great question. I think you've highlighted the first one that I do often, which is read. So sometimes I will just look at what other people are doing in my type of research to see what they're using. And the second answer is it might sound kind of silly, but just Google it. You like sometimes I will Google theories related to, and I will try to put in just quite a few keywords. And then I'll just start looking and see what happens from my search that way. If you have access to a library, you can also do that. You could type in theory and then some of those keywords. And I think that can help you find things too. But there can be really, there's so many different theories, especially now, and especially with the internet. And, like we can find so much more. And so sometimes there's like a very small or niche theory that can really explain something well, but it can be hard to find. And so I think that's one of those where you just have to try to read a lot. Um, it's just a lot of reading or looking. I really do Google quite a bit, which is helpful.
Thank you. No shortcuts, it sounds like.
No, unfortunately. Another thing I like to do is I actually keep a list of theories that are helpful to me, and I kind of group them together because that way, when I'm starting to work on a new project or with somebody, I can kind of go back and I have a list of resources that I've been developing. And so that gets just longer over time. There's another question in the chat. In some qualitative research aim to build theory, when should we begin thinking about or applying using a theoretical lens? That's a great question. the sooner the better, right? The earlier you can start to think about it, I think will be helpful. If you're wanting to build onto or contribute to an existing theory, I would start with that. So I would start with thinking about the theory and then the context that you're looking at, and then see how you would implement that and try to develop contributions that way. So if you're wanting to contribute to theory that's already been established and build onto it, I think earlier. Sometimes though, things are serendipitous and maybe you have data and you start looking at it and things can pop up that were unexpected. That definitely happens and you can still do that, but I really think earlier is better. There's another question in the chat. I would like to know what design or approach is suitable for integrating artificial intelligence and universal design learning on improving writing skills. That's a great question. That's a little bit outside of my particular expertise, but I'm imagining you're asking about what theory would be helpful. And so what I would think about in that is what you are trying to look at. Are you looking at um, if it's individual writing skills, then you might want to, maybe some things in identity theory might be helpful, like student perceptions of their writing and their confidence in it. So you might pull some things in there. But if you're also focused on technology or learning, you could pull in some other theories. Possibly expectancy value theory is one you might look at, which helps us think about if we expect a tool to be successful, then we will use it more. Um, Dr. Pinkerton put in critical disability studies for that too. So you might read like a broad range of studies and see what theories are being used there. These are great questions. It can be hard to find theories and it can be hard to find the right one or ones that will work well for your study. So again, I think just trying to read a lot and try to find different ones. And then kind of like I'm visual, so I like to map things out. So I'll sometimes draw about like what is in the theory and then try to connect it to my own research. And then sometimes that's where you might find like maybe it's not quite aligned or maybe it lines up really nicely.
Hey, Leah, can I say a comment real fast or a suggestion?
Oh, please.
Also with the theory, I've kind of mentors I've worked with can also read outside of our field and discipline. Just looking beyond education. Kind of some of the folks I work with, they bring theories from like plant, like gardening, as a metaphor to think about like growing and teaching and learning. So just going like like pushing ourselves to get beyond the education literature and thinking about how we can adapt theoretical frameworks to the research that we're doing.
Yes, that's a great suggestion. I think reading outside of our field is really helpful. Um, so yeah, I love that suggestion. I think we're right at time, so I'll just put in the chat my email, and if anybody ever has questions or I can be helpful, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, thank you for the opportunity to get to chat with you all today. I really enjoyed it, and I hope it was helpful.
Lydia, thank you so much. And I just shared we have two more research sessions coming up in February and March. So everyone, please feel free to sign up through the QR code on the left, and you can learn more about GIFT on the right. We really want to thank Lydia today. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone. And we'll stay on for a few more minutes if anyone has any more questions. Thank you.